Redhawks. In our next video, we're going to dig into the Wcag 2.1 standards. And before we get into the details of what the standards themselves looks like, we're going to look more at the big picture organizational structure that's in place, which, as we looked at in the last video, comes back to the acronym POUR. What POUR stands for is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Those are our four big pillars. So like I said, within each of those, there are a bunch of substandards that we'll mention as we move through the course. But instead of trying to remember every single detailed standard, it's kind of easier when we're designing and creating accessible content to just remember the four big pillars or the four big boxes that we want to use. So the first one, perceivable. Can students experience the content in a way that works for them? This is going to be a lot of the things that you probably think about when it comes to accessibility. This is probably the area that you have the most impact on as an instructor. So this is probably going to be the one that you're going to focus on and think about the most. Not to say that the other ones aren't important and don't need to be taken into consideration, but this is the big one. So what does it mean? We're just saying that all the material has to be presented so that it can be perceived, regardless of what use of or lack of use of senses a student has, or what assistive technology they may need or use. So this is the visual, auditory, and it can also be cognitive disabilities as well. So what does that look like in Canvas? What's some more tangible examples we can wrap our minds around? Things like with images, making sure there's alt text. So if a student's using a screen reader, it doesn't just say image or read a file name. It actually describes what that image is so that they get the same general experience that somebody that has full vision gets. Captions in your videos and transcripts. We've talked before at different times about using Kaltura, which takes care of a lot of that for you. And then things like contrast and color, making sure that things are high contrast and not following all those rules. And that we're not using just color to convey meaning, that we don't just bold headings, that we actually use the heading classifications so that, again, screen readers can distinguish better when they're reading the content to the user. Operable. Can students navigate and use the content effectively? This is one that is going to be out of your hands in a lot of ways. The vendor or the site itself needs to take care of a lot of that. You can't go in and change some of these things, but it's not to say that you shouldn't still be aware of these when you're evaluating materials. Basically, when we talk about being operable, everything has to be usable by all students. So students that use assistive devices or maybe can only use a keyboard for input, we have to make sure that they can navigate from place to place and get to links and to all the content and materials they need to, given they don't have reliance on a mouse to be able to click. A lot of times this is students with motor and vision impairments, but it could fall into some other categories as well. What does this look like? There are things that you can do to make things more operable. So like navigation within your course, making sure that your modules are organized and use a pretty consistent structure, or that any pages or content that you create is the same way. That way, when if I'm a student using a screen reader to find something, and I start to try to kind of predict where things will be so I don't have to listen to the screen read me every single word every single time, I know that I can skip ahead, and then if I get down to the third part of the module, that's probably roughly where the materials are going to be or where the assignment's going to be. So that is one thing that you can do in the operable pillar, is to make sure that you're consistent in how you're putting things together and making sure that those things are as structured as possible. Other things that you need to consider or think about, even though you don't have any ultimate control over, other than not using something that's not accessible, is things like keyboard access. If I'm a student who can't use the mouse, I can only use the keyboard, or I use some other sort of assistive input, whether I hold a device in my mouth and click on things, or maybe I'd have no ability to control a keyboard or a mouse. So I have to use vision or voice. I need to make sure that when I'm looking at materials to use for my course, that I'm taking that into consideration. Some things are not built very accessible. Obviously, everybody is in the same boat as us in trying to make accessible content, so people are being more mindful of that. But if you're using an external website, something you might want to consider is how does that get operated by somebody that wouldn't be able to use a mouse, or you're looking at publisher materials. The other thing you can think of is being making sure you're flexible on timed work. Just because something is operable doesn't mean that it's easily operable. Take an example of somebody who has no use of their hands, and they have to navigate using a tool that they hold with their mouth. It's not always a situation where they need extra time because they have a comprehension issue. It's just a matter of it takes them 2 or 3 times as long to input the same information that somebody who can use a keyboard and mouse would be able to do. So things like that we can be mindful of when we're making things accessible. Next portion is understandable. Is the content clear and predictable? So we just want to make sure that things are easy to read, easy to follow, and are predictable in how things are organized and their behavior. This a lot of times gets into more of those students with cognitive disabilities. Not to say that it couldn't affect any student, though. When things have consistent and predictable layouts, when the instructions are clear and things are in very plain language, it just makes the course easier for students to use. So some examples here using headings when we're creating content, H2 and 3 and so on, instead of just using the bold and italics like we mentioned before. Making sure that our layout and our modules are consistent. Maybe every module has an overview of that module or the chapter or unit or whatever, however you set that up. And then it has, the reading for the section. Then it has a video to watch. Then it has the assignment. We keep that consistent, and our naming conventions are good. That helps students who might struggle just to make sense of where everything is at, let alone make sense of the actual content. That makes the course more accessible to them. Make sure we're using plain language, avoiding jargon. That's not to say that we can't have high-level content when we get into the actual material that we're learning, but for things like instructions and things of that nature, we want to make that to be as clear as possible, as understandable as possible. So an example being, utilize the aforementioned resources. A lot of people could figure out what that means, but use the resources listed above is much more clear and direct. Now I'm not trying to decipher or think through extra steps in order just to figure out what I'm supposed to do. Leave the heavy lifting for the content. And then our last one, robust. Will the content work reliably with current and future technologies? Again, this is one that's kind of out of your hands, but one that you should be mindful of and should kind of test and preview when you're going through things. Basically just means that we need to make sure that our materials look the same regardless of if we're on our cell phone, a tablet, a browser, we use assistive technologies, that it comes across consistently. We can't assume that a student's going to interact with content in a certain way. I think most of us would probably hope that they're using a computer and a browser, but we know that's not always the case, whether it's a matter of preference or convenience or just they have to because that's all that's available to them. Again, Canvas does a pretty good job in making sure that things are consistent across the mobile app and the browser version. But when you get into adding your own documents, whether it's a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, that stuff might not always appear the same way. So you just got to be cognizant of that. Simple things you can do, just make sure that when you can use the rich content editor, that helps to keep things clean and accessible. Try to avoid making things in external content if possible. If you can make it as a Canvas page, make it as a Canvas page. If it has to be a Word or a PDF, just make sure that it passes the accessibility checks. There are some resources here that you can take a look at. The actual guidelines themselves, which we'll talk more about in subsequent videos. Looking again at that final rule from the Department of Justice under ADA Title II, a little bit more detailed introduction to web accessibility, talking about the accessibility checker in Canvas, which we'll get into in other videos as well. And this is a really good video with some more examples of students who have to rely on assistive technologies and some of the struggles they face. So that's definitely worth a watch as well. Again, there should be a link in the description here that will take you to the TLDE SharePoint page, and you can find all these slides and other resources linked there.